You're watching Tag TV. Tahir Gora is your host in Candid Talk. Today, I'm joined with a very seasoned and accomplished politician, Mr. Tony Clement. Welcome, sir, to my studio.
Thank you. It's nice to be called seasoned, but hope that's not a prelude to getting baked or something, you know.
No, I mean, when I say seasoned, I meant that you're serving a government for the fourth term.
Absolutely.
And you're also critic of foreign affairs.
Yes, I am.
And you're a member of parliament from Parry Sound and Muskoka.
That is absolutely correct.
Before you served as politician in Ontario Legislative.
I did.
And you were health minister. You also served as health minister in federal government.
Yep.
And you had great exposure to politics as well as to our community.
It's been a long journey. I was also in the Ontario government, environment minister, municipal affairs minister, and transportation minister. So I held all those portfolios in Ontario and then was able to serve in 4 portfolios in Canada too. So it's been quite a journey for sure.
Wonderful, wonderful. And hopefully we would love to see you sometime Prime Minister of Canada as well.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you. Well, we'll see what the future holds, but I'm certainly looking at my options in terms of the leadership at this point for the Conservative Party. Yeah.
And as a very dynamic, passionate politician, and very experienced, and again I'll use the phrase seasoned politician.
Sure, sure.
And so how you take this new Liberal government, particularly as a critic to foreign affairs issues?
Well, we just saw the commemoration, I suppose, of the 6-month anniversary of the Trudeau government. So there's been already some media consideration of what this means and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I think it's safe to say that the Liberals are acting like Liberals. They've raised taxes, they've reduced benefits for working families, such as some of the tax credits we put in for the health tax credits and the school book tax credits, those kinds of things. They've increased taxes on small businesses. And of course, for our future generations, including your viewers, this massive debt that we're piling up, the bills will come in at some point. So that's on the economic side. On the foreign policy side, I think they've made some major errors based on a misunderstanding of Canada's values and Canada's interests. The biggest one of all, in my view and the view of Conservatives, is stepping back from the war against ISIS. You know, Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals are very proud, and they puff up their chests a little bit and they say Canada is back. Well, there was an example of Canada is backing away. By grounding our bombers, they have increased our presence on the ground. But of course, without the bombers there's greater risk for our trainers on the ground. So we think this is a major problem at a time when the alliance is stepping up the battle against ISIS. You know, it's been successful to the extent that ISIS has lost 40% of its territory since the Allied mission has started. But for the other 60%, you know, it's going to be a big effort. And so everybody needs to work on that. And I really feel that Canada is not pulling its weight.
Right. As you explained the consequences of not supporting that war against ISIS. So do you see any potential change in Liberal Party point of view in terms of their presence and in terms of their combat mission against ISIS? I
really don't see it. I think that they have just decided that there's going to be no air mission at all. The defense minister has made it clear that we have advisors on the ground. That's about it. Now, we are advising the Kurds. That's the right thing to do. And in fact, part of our mission when we were a Conservative government was to advise the Kurds. But there's more that has to be done. I mean, the ground forces, which are primarily Kurds at this point, have a huge challenge ahead of them to retake the city of Mosul, which, as you probably know, has over 1 million people. This is not just a bunch of terrorists in a few tents in the desert. They control a major city. And so for us to be meaningful, we thought that the air power of our CF-18 jets would be the way to do that. So this is a big time, an important time for the alliance against Islamic State. We know that they are committing genocide against minority Muslim populations, Yazidis, other minority groups, Christians, and yet the liberal government refuses to call it genocide. Pardon me. I was in front of the, I was part of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, and we had 3 Yazidi women give evidence of what is happening on the ground in areas controlled by Islamic State. And I don't want to get too graphic, but there's no question that with all of the exterminations, the rapes, slavery of women and children, this is genocide. And for the Canadian government not to recognize that when the US government recognizes it, pardon me, the UK Parliament recognizes it. So this is the world view. It's not just conservatives and opposition saying this. And yet we have not moved an inch to recognize the genocide that is going on. It's very disappointing because our foreign policy as Canadians should recognize our interests, of course, as Canadians, but also fight for human rights. I think that's what Canadians expect out of our foreign policy, and yet here's a good example where we're not doing that.
Right. As you're talking about our foreign affairs, a new phase towards ISIS, do you see any change towards other Middle Eastern issues?
Well, the other one that we have been tracking very closely is, of course, the volte-face when it comes to Iran. And last week on Parliament Hill, I co-hosted an Iran Accountability Week with Senator Linda Frupp. And we had experts come in, do seminars. We had hearings in the Senate committee. And it's very clear when I asked the questions in the House of Commons to Stéphane Dion, our Foreign Affairs Minister, that they are, in fact, having consultations with the Iranians with a view to normalizing relations, reopening the embassy in Tehran. The Iranians could open up an embassy in Ottawa. This is problematic for both idealistic reasons and practical reasons. Idealistic reasons. Here's a government, first of all, that oppresses its own people. That's been well documented. They are a state sponsor of terror, and by that I mean it is state policy. It's the policy of the government of Iran, not just some individuals who happen to be Iranian. It's state policy of the government of Iran to support terrorist groups like Al-Quds and Hamas and Hezbollah. In fact, they allocate in their budget hundreds of millions of dollars a year in support of those organizations, terrorist organizations. It's also state policy to eradicate the state of Israel from the face of the earth. That's their state policy. And in fact, after the signing of the nuclear deal, the Iranians, in violation of UN resolutions, launched ballistic missiles and had painted on the missiles, these were just test launches, painted on the missiles anti-Israel and anti-Semitic language, painted on the missiles. So it's very clear that they do not want the state of Israel to exist at all, and they want to eradicate it, exterminate the Israeli people. So that's what you're dealing with. You know, so to say that Iran is a normal country where we could have normalized relations, it's false. They're not a normal country. They don't want to be a normal country. By normal, I mean a country that is willing to join the family of nations searching for peaceful solutions. They don't want to be that kind of country. It's not part of the Islamic fundamentalist Shia dogma that dominates the Iranian politics of today, unfortunately. So to normalize relations violates our own principles as a nation. Second point is practical things. you know, it's common practice in Tehran, if the Iranian government doesn't like a move by a country, all of a sudden a mob forms outside and they throw Molotov cocktails at the embassy. They did that just a few months ago with Saudi Arabia. So we, you know, I'm very concerned that we can't protect our diplomats in Tehran. Second thing is they'd open up an embassy in Ottawa. Well, the last time they had an embassy in Ottawa, it was used, and this is documented in court documents, it was used by the Iranian government to spy on Iranian Canadians, citizens of Canada. And that's completely unacceptable. So I'm very disappointed that the Canadian government, the Liberal government, is moving towards normalizing relations. I've recommended that they go slow on lifting sanctions, and that they actually add new sanctions because of these ballistic missile tests, and that they certainly do not open up embassies until Iran is serious about joining the community of peaceful nations.
Right. As you mentioned that Iran is kind of a threat to Israel.
Yep.
So how do you see our relationship with Israel? Because Canada happened to be a very close friend.
Yes.
But now there is something.
Things are changing.
Changing.
Yeah, things are changing. There's no question.
That?
Well, and part of it is this this theory that we should have a balanced position in the Middle East, which is peddled by you know, self-proclaimed experts, may I say. But the problem with that is, of course, it's not balanced. When you move away from supporting Israel, you are actually damaging the ability of Israel to survive in a very dangerous neighborhood. And what we should be doing is supporting Israel. Now, that doesn't mean not speaking out about what we think the best solution is. The best solution is a two-state solution on the Palestinian issue. The best solution is negotiated in good faith by the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. That's Canada's position, and it should be Canada's position. Right. But, you know, when Israel is being attacked by nations like Iran, who want to exterminate it, I think there should be no hesitation to support the state of Israel. We're moving to a stage now, however, where things are getting a bit gray. So all of a sudden, there's a UN agency that works in Gaza. We, as a government, as a conservative government, had suspended aid to that agency because the agency was funneling the aid to Hamas, a terrorist organization. Now, I suspect we're on our way to refunding that agency because we want to be the good guys at the UN. I think that's wrong. And it's not going to help Middle East peace or security. So it's these kinds of issues. And I'm not here to say that there's some boardroom in Liberal Party headquarters where they're deciding, you know, how can we get at the state of Israel? I don't think that's it, quite frankly. I want to be honest with you. But I think what's happening is other decisions being made by this Liberal government will have the impact of hurting Israel's ability to survive. And that's unacceptable.
Right. What are your concerns in the wake of presence of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Muslimhood here in Canada? There are several reports that they are organizing, they are growing in our own soil. We've
got to work with our own security agencies, but more importantly, we've got to work with progressive Muslim groups. Because, you know, Tony Clement can say that this is unfortunate and wrong, but I think there's many Muslims that I've talked to in the GTA, in Vancouver, Montreal, who are very, very concerned about this development, firstly, and secondly, they need our support.
Right.
And so we have to find ways to support them. The other thing we've got to do is to make sure that outside funding is not going to madrasas and mosques with the view to radicalize the individuals there. And so these are, and the third thing is we all know online, there's a lot of recruitment going on for radical Islam causes online. Our young people, the mother and the father may not even be aware what the son or the daughter is accessing online. So we've got to help our Muslim parents to be able to combat that. And whether it's an online presence or better ways to identify these online recruiters, we've got to do more than we're doing now. I think that's the bottom line.
You said that we should help countering this Islamic radical ideology here in Canada. But on the other hand, we see that the Liberal government is not much concerned about this.
This is my concern, that it's fallen off the agenda. And I know there was a big debate in this country about Bill C-51, for instance, the anti-terrorism bill. The Liberals voted for that, but they have pledged to change the bill in some way. I will watch very closely to see how they make those changes. But we've got to help not only our security personnel, they're just a means to an end. We've got to help people on the front lines, Muslim parents, people in the moderate Muslim community who are seeing this radicalization all around them. And my view is we've got to help and enable these groups to communicate the right thing and to identify those, many of them who are foreign funded in the community, to weed them out of the community. I think that's really for the best help we can do to avoid the situations we're seeing in Paris and Brussels and other parts of the world.
Last two things I need your opinion on. One is economy. You served as President Treasury Board, and you are a great economist as well through your political career, what we have seen. So how about our economy today, and what do you see future in the next couple of years?
It's not very clear. The world economy there are projections of slower growth. There's no question about it. And there's a number of factors that are destabilizing factors. Let's take a little tour around the world for a second. Obviously, China is slowing down in its growth, and therefore its need to buy natural resources, oil, precious metals is commensurately reduced. So that's one factor. Second, and there's there's always talk, although we don't see it yet, of whether China can maintain, in lower growth economy, can maintain its pressure on its people to not, riot or rebel or what have you, because there basically are riots every week in China against corruption, let's say. And the only way to contain that hitherto has been through 20 and 30 years of growth. So there's China. Then you've got Europe. Well, in Europe, you've got dual crises going on. You've got the economic crisis. You've got Britain looking at whether they're going to remain in the European Union or not, the Brexit battle going on in Britain right now. And then you've got, overlaying all of that is the migrant crisis, as they call it. And it is a destabilizing influence on the politics of Europe, and therefore when you have an unstable political climate, it's not good for economic growth. Then you've got the United States. Growth is higher, but we're entering a phase of the U.S. political elections. I don't know what's going to happen there. Nobody does, but it's not going to be the same old President Obama, after November. So again, another destabilizing factor. So these are things that have an impact on the Canadian economy. What we wanted to see was a recognition in the budget that for now, the best thing to do for the Canadian economy is to keep taxes low, to keep spending within our means, and to invest strategically in infrastructure that's going to help us in the long term. That's the balancing act. But in the budget, we don't have balance. We've got a lot of spending, although we don't know where it's going. No one's really told us where the spending is. Taxes are going up. And from that perspective, we feel that the fiscal policy of the government is out of kilter with the uncertainties that are around us. At the same time, the Canadian economy is still growing. So to say, well, we need to spend this money because we're in a recession. Well, we're not in a recession. We're not in a recession. But we have specific challenges in specific provinces. Obviously, the province of Alberta is a huge challenge right now. It was before the Fort McMurray fires, but it's certainly even more so now. But Saskatchewan is growing. BC is growing. Ontario has shown some growth. So you can't just say that everything's bad everywhere in the economy. There are points of light and there's points of darkness. And I just think that it was a very blunt, the budget was a very blunt instrument, that it wasn't, it wasn't designed for the modern Canadian economy. And this, if they continue along this approach, I think that Canada will suffer as a result.
In connection with the economy, do you see any concern or any change in our economy in terms of Syrian refugee migration to Canada?
Well, in terms of that, obviously the government a bit late met their targets. And I'm sure that there'll be another target that will be announced. What I find concerning, I've met with groups in my own community. So there was a lot of private sponsorship going on. Churches, mosques, service groups, all wanted to sponsor Syrian refugees. Well, once the government met its goal through its government refugee program, they turned off the tap for all of these groups who had raised all this money, had rented accommodation, had bought food, had a match with a family. They were actually conversing with the family, you know, in Lebanon or Jordan or wherever the family was, and now they can't come over. And I just think that this is nonsense, that all of these groups in our community who wanted to not only bring them over, that's the easy part, but work with the family over a course of a year or two to get them settled into our country. That's what you want. You want continued attachment with the new refugee families, right? But that whole system is ground to a halt because the government, the Liberal government, wanted to have success with its government refugee program, where we have had cases of holding them up in hotel rooms in Toronto and elsewhere for weeks on end, no schooling for the kids, you know, no proper food, no halal food or proper food, and no hope of getting accommodation. That's not the way to settle refugees appropriately with the greatest chance of success. But that's the path that the Liberal government chose. Right.
So in the end, I'd like to know about Conservative Party policy. I still call Conservative government because it has been 9 years.
Yeah, indeed.
Indeed. And what is a Conservative Party strategy in terms of engaging multicultural communities, particularly in areas like Greater Toronto area?
Great question.
Where there is a very negative stereotype, unfortunately, by some of the media, some of the community, and by their opponent parties.
Right, right.
And since you have worked with all those multicultural communities very closely.
Yes, I have.
So, and also you are a candidate for leadership for Conservative Party.
Maybe, so, we'll see.
Okay, that's a good news, I would say. So what is the strategy of Conservative Party?
Well, we have to rebuild the strategy. Clearly, the strategy was working until it didn't work. And there were echoes of this, by the way, in the city of London, UK, in the last election. Well, in the UK mayoral election just earlier this week, where the Conservative Party ran a failed campaign, and the Labour Party candidate Sadiq Khan was successful. And so there were echoes of that based on a failed strategy, which was very similar to our failed strategy. So I think we've just got to start again. I'm an immigrant to this country. You know, I was born in the UK. My dad was born in Cyprus, Greek Cypriot. My mother's mother was born in Syria, in Aleppo. And so, you know, I think we've just got to demonstrate that we are, as a force, as a political force, in tune with the hopes and aspirations of people who are newcomers, relative newcomers to our country. And it's going to take, a policy by policy approach, perhaps, but it's also going to take us going out into the community, communicating better, communicating our values better, communicating how we have common interests better, using all the techniques that are available now, social media as well as more common, like ethnic media, more common approaches in the past. And I think that when we do that, we will illustrate that the values of the community are our values. And I don't want to simplify it too much, but these are aspirational people. They came to the country, they made a choice to come to this country because they wanted a better life for themselves and for their kids. That's why my parents came to this country and dragged me along as a 4-year-old. And so that's the aspiration when I say aspirational people. And so, yeah, well, that's what we represent as conservatives. We want lower taxes. We want a government that's efficient and effective. We want a strong military to protect our interests elsewhere. I think we want to have fiscal prudence when it comes to balancing the budget. Those are things that the great majority of newcomers believe in. And so there's no barrier to supporting conservatives, except that sometimes they get told by liberals that conservatives are antithetical to their interests and values. So I think we just have to get out there and show them with our presence and our policies that that's not the case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tony Clement, joining me today.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that we have a very useful dialogue.
Thank you.
Viewers, thank you for watching my show, Candid Talk, on Multicultural TV, TAG TV.
#1 multicultural channel. This is TAG TV.